Where do all the dead things go? A terrifying truth. Have you ever wondered why the world isn't overflowing with the dead? Every day, animals die. Insects, birds, even people. But you don't see them piling up on the streets. You don't walk through forests covered in endless bones. So, where do all the dead things go? That's the question I asked my father when I was a child. And his answer? I didn't understand it back then. But years later, I wish I had. Because what I learned still haunts me to this day. I was about 6 years old when I saw it. A small, lifeless bird lying on the sidewalk. Its tiny, delicate body was curled slightly, as if it had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Its beak was slightly open, its feathers ruffled and uneven. The wind tugged at them gently, as if trying to wake it, but it didn't move. I remember feeling frozen in place, staring down at it with a strange mix of emotions. Fascination, sadness, and something deeper. Something I couldn't quite put into words at the time. I knew what death was. Even as a kid, I understood that everything living would eventually stop moving, stop breathing. But what I didn't understand was why it wasn't everywhere. I looked up at my father, who had stopped a few steps ahead when he realized I wasn't following him. He was a strong, steady man, the kind of father you always felt safe around. He was never one to talk down to me, never brushed off my questions the way some adults do with kids. So I knew if I asked him something, he would take it seriously. "Daddy, where do all the dead things go?" He gave me a curious look before walking back and kneeling beside me. I remember his eyes, warm, patient. He was always like that. "What do you mean, bud?" I hesitated, trying to put my thoughts together. "Well, everything that's alive has to die, right?" He nodded. "That's right. And the world's really, really old." Another nod. I pointed at the bird. "Then how come we don't see dead things everywhere? Shouldn't there be a lot more of them?" For a moment, my father just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, he let out a quiet chuckle and ruffled my hair. "That's a smart question." But he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, as if choosing his words carefully. Then, in a voice softer than before, he said, "Well, when something dies, its spirit goes back to where it came from." That wasn't what I was asking, though. "Yeah, but what about the bodies?" He sighed, glancing down at the bird again. "Something takes care of that," he said simply. "It's just the way the world works." That answer stuck with me. It wasn't what I expected. I had thought he'd say something about nature, or maybe how people clean up the streets. But there was something about the way he said it, something that made it sound bigger. Like it wasn't just about this bird, or just about nature. At the time, I didn't question it. I was a kid. I trusted my dad. And when he took my hand and gently led me away from the tiny body on the sidewalk, I let the question fade. But I never really forgot it. Over the years, the question would come back to me from time to time. Whenever I saw roadkill on the side of the highway and then noticed it was gone the next day. Whenever I'd walk through the woods and realize I never saw piles of dead animals, even though so many creatures lived and died there. I even brought it up in school once. In 5th grade, we had a science unit about ecosystems, and I thought maybe the answer would finally make sense to me. Decomposers, my teacher said. Bacteria, fungi, scavengers. That's what cleans up dead things in nature. It made sense, logically, but something about it still didn't feel right. Because if that were true, wouldn't we see it happening more? Shouldn't we see more bodies in the process of breaking down? Shouldn't forests be littered with animal skeletons? Shouldn't lakes have floating fish that never got eaten? I didn't push the thought too hard. I didn't want to sound weird. But every so often, I'd remember my father's words. Something takes care of that. And every time I thought about it, I felt a strange, creeping sense of unease. The first time I really started to question it was in high school. A group of us went hiking deep into the woods. We weren't supposed to. There were parts of the forest that weren't maintained, and some of the older kids swore it was easy to get lost in them. But we were young, dumb, and thought we were invincible. We walked for miles, getting farther and farther from the main trails. At one point, my friend Mark tripped on something. We thought it was just a root, but when we looked closer, it was a deer skull. Bleached white, smooth, completely clean, which wasn't weird in itself, except there was nothing else. No fur, no bones scattered around, no smell of decay, just a skull. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. And yet, we had been the first people to step into that part of the woods in a long time. Something about it unsettled me. I could tell the others felt it too, even though nobody wanted to say anything. After a minute, Mark shrugged and tossed the skull into the trees. Let's keep going. So we did. But something about that moment stuck with me. If a deer had died there, shouldn't there have been more? If scavengers had taken care of it, why was the skull left so perfectly untouched? I didn't say anything, but later that night as I lay in bed, I found myself remembering that dead bird from when I was 6 years old. And my father's voice, soft but certain. Something takes care of that. Years went by. I went to college. I got a job. I forgot all about that question until I moved into the cabin, until I saw the eye staring at me from the door, until I heard the whispers at night, until I realized my father had been right. Something does take care of the dead. And soon, I was about to learn exactly what. The isolated cabin, a strange new home. Finding a place to live after college was harder than I expected. Housing prices were insane, and my entry-level salary barely covered the essentials. I scoured rental listings, hoping for something, anything, that wouldn't force me to have a roommate again. At first, I looked at the typical places: apartment complexes, rental houses, even basement units in people's homes. But everything in my budget was either a shoebox or in a part of town where I'd probably wake up to my car missing. Then I found the ad. For rent. 1-bedroom cabin. $350 a month. I had to do a double take. $350. That was less than half of what I was expecting to pay. I almost ignored it. Deals that good usually meant something was very wrong. But curiosity got the best of me. I checked the address. It wasn't in a dangerous neighborhood, but it was isolated, right on the edge of town, near the old railroad tracks. That area had a strange reputation. It used to be a thriving mill district, back when the lumber industry was still booming. But over time, regulations, cheaper imports, and economic downturns had killed most of the businesses. The once busy roads had grown quiet. The houses, originally built for mill workers, had become rundown over the years. Some were abandoned. Others were rented out cheaply to people who didn't mind a bit of neglect. Still, that kind of deal was hard to pass up. I called the number in the listing. A man picked up after 2 rings. Yeah? His voice was rough, like he had been chain smoking for 40 years. Hi. I'm calling about the cabin for rent? Oh. Yeah. You want to come see it? Something about his tone felt off. Most landlords ask at least a couple of questions. Job situation, rental history, something. This guy just wanted me there. Sure, I said hesitantly. When are you available? He laughed. I'm here now. Come by anytime. I hesitated. That wasn't normal. Landlords don't usually sit around waiting for people to show up. But against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him later that afternoon. The drive out to the cabin was uneventful, but as I neared the property, I started to understand why the rent was so low. The area felt forgotten. The road leading to it was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through the concrete. Rusted out cars sat in driveways. The old train tracks ran parallel to the neighborhood, long abandoned, now overgrown with tall grass and scattered debris. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, just as I had expected. One story, with faded beige paint that was peeling in places. The trim had been painted a pale green at some point, but the sun had drained the color, leaving it dull and lifeless. The front porch sagged slightly, as if time and neglect had worn it down. A for rent sign was stuck in the dirt, slightly crooked. I pulled into the gravel driveway, my tires crunching against loose stones. The landlord was already there, leaning against the side of the house. He was a wiry man, probably in his 60s, with leathery skin and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His shirt was stained, and his jeans looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. You the kid who called? He asked, squinting at me through the smoke. Yeah. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a handshake, just took a drag from his cigarette and flicked the ashes onto the ground. Come on in, I'll show you around. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly nice. I had expected it to be as run down as the outside, but it was clear someone had put in some effort to clean it up. The front door opened directly into a small living area with new carpet. The kitchen, though tiny, had fresh linoleum and modern appliances. The bathroom was cramped, with only a shower and a toilet, but it was clean. The bedroom barely fit a double bed, but it had a small closet. Inside, I noticed something unusual. One of those combination washer-dryer units, stuffed into the space. It was cozy. It was cheap. It was exactly what I needed. I barely even thought about the fact that the last tenant had left in a hurry. I should have. I'll take it, I said. The landlord grinned, showing yellowed teeth. Good. First and last month's rent up front. No deposit. That should have been another red flag. Who rents out a place without a deposit? Most landlords are paranoid about getting screwed over. But I was too excited to care. I handed over the money, signed the lease, and that was it. No background check, no references, nothing. I moved in that Monday. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I loved having my own space. No roommates. No shared walls with noisy neighbors. Just peace and quiet. I made friends with Tom, the guy who lived next door. He was in his late 50s, retired, and spent most of his time sitting on his porch with a can of beer. He had lived there for years, so I figured he'd be a good person to talk to. You picked an interesting place to live, he said one evening, sipping his drink. Yeah? I asked. He smirked. not many people stick around long. I laughed. What? Is it haunted or something? That was supposed to be a joke. But Tom didn't laugh. Instead, he spit a glob of tobacco onto the dirt and looked at me with something that almost resembled pity. Nah, he said. Nothing like that. But I could tell he was lying. The first strange thing happened a couple of weeks later. I had just gotten home from work and was about to open the door when I froze. There, right in the middle of the wood, was an eye. It wasn't a decoration. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a real human eye, staring at me. I blinked, and it blinked back. Every muscle in my body locked up. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The door was normal, perfectly smooth. I ran my fingers over the wood, feeling for anything unusual. But there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was I just tired? Or was something watching me? From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I entered the cabin, I felt like something was there, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but then the whispers started. And that's when I knew I had made a mistake moving in. A big mistake. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. The eye I saw on my door, a trick of the light, a weird shadow. Maybe even just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was still getting used to living alone. But as much as I tried to forget about it, the feeling never went away. Every time I came home, it felt like something was waiting. Like the air inside the cabin was different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I started noticing little things. The way the back of my neck would prickle when I stepped inside. Like unseen eyes were locked onto me. The way shadows seemed to stretch in ways they shouldn't, just out of the corner of my vision. The strange silence at night. Too silent. Like the world outside my cabin had ceased to exist the moment the sun went down. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was just adjusting to my new place. And then I talked to Tom again. One evening, I invited Tom over for beers. He was a good guy, laid back, no nonsense. The kind of person who had seen a lot and didn't get rattled easily. We sat outside on the small patch of grass that passed for a front yard. The air was cool, the crickets were chirping, and for the first time all week, I felt relaxed. Until I made the mistake of asking him, "Hey, do you know why the last tenant left?" Tom paused. He took a slow sip of his beer, then turned his head and spat a glob of tobacco into the dirt. I expected him to say something simple. Maybe the guy got a better job. Maybe he moved in with his girlfriend. Instead, Tom gave me a long, unreadable look. "He left because of your cabin." I forced a laugh. "Come on, man. What, you think it's haunted or something?" Tom didn't laugh. Instead, he let out a slow breath and looked past me toward the cabin's darkened windows. "Nah," he said finally. "Not haunted." He didn't elaborate. I waited for him to say more, but he just kept drinking, like he had already said too much. I don't know why, but something about the way he said it bothered me. Not haunted, not safe either, not normal. That night, I sat in my living room long after the sun had gone down, staring at the walls, listening to the silence. It was strange. I had been living here for weeks, but suddenly the entire place felt foreign to me, like it didn't belong to me, like I didn't belong in it. I told myself Tom was just messing with me, that he had spun some local ghost story to scare me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't some campfire story. This was real. The next night, I woke up at 3:12 a.m. At first, I didn't know why. I wasn't having a nightmare. I didn't need to pee. I hadn't heard any noise. And yet, something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the heavy, groggy feeling weighing me down. My body felt sluggish, like I had been in a deep sleep just moments before. That's when I noticed it. The air felt different. Not cold, not warm, just charged, like how the air feels before a thunderstorm. Thick, with something unseen. I swallowed, pushing myself up on my elbows. That's when I heard it. A whisper. So quiet, I thought I imagined it. Then, again, right outside my bedroom door. I stopped breathing. My entire body locked up. Every muscle frozen in place. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just listened. The whispering was low, incoherent, like a voice speaking a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. It sounded wrong, like words that weren't meant to be spoken by human tongues. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for my phone. I just waited. And then, a soft creak came from just outside my door. The floorboards, as if something had stepped closer. I don't know how long I lay there. It felt like hours. But at some point, the whispering stopped. The feeling of being watched faded, and somehow, despite everything, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a half-awake hallucination. But deep down I knew. Something had been inside my cabin, and it had been standing right outside my door. That evening, as I left for work, I passed by Tom's house. He was on his porch, as usual, drinking a beer. I slowed down. I wasn't sure if I should bring it up. But before I could say anything, Tom spoke. "Didn't sleep well, huh?" I stopped. My mouth went dry. "How'd you know?" Tom didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, like he was deciding whether or not to tell me something important. Then finally he said, "You don't gotta believe me, kid. But if I were you?" He took a long sip of his beer, swallowed, then looked me straight in the eye. I'd stop asking questions. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to tell him I wasn't scared. But the truth was, I was. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why I felt watched in my own home. I didn't know what that whispering was. But for the first time since I moved in, I was starting to wonder if I had made a very, very big mistake. At first I convinced myself that what happened the night before, the whispers, the creaking floorboards, the feeling of being watched, was just a bad dream. Sleep paralysis, maybe. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been standing outside my bedroom door, and whatever it wasn't human. I didn't tell anyone, not Tom, not my coworkers. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, I think my house is haunted by something that whispers in a language I don't understand." Yeah, that would go over well. So instead, I went about my day like everything was normal. Like I hadn't woken up to something standing right outside my door. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse things got. That night, I did something I normally never do. I locked my bedroom door. I had never been the kind of person who felt the need to lock my doors at night, especially not my bedroom. But after what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. I didn't want to take any chances. The lock clicked into place, and I let out a shaky breath. But even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt it. That same heavy air. That charged feeling. Like something unseen had slipped into the room with me. And then, a tap on the door. Just a light, gentle tap. Like someone testing to see if I was awake. I held my breath, my entire body locking up. I couldn't move. Another tap. And then, the handle turned. I nearly gasped out loud as I watched it shift. Slowly, deliberately. Something was trying to open my door. I threw the blankets over my head like a damn kid hiding from the monster under the bed. My heart slamming against my ribs. The handle twisted harder. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. And then, silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound, any whisper, any sign that it was still there. But I heard nothing. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out from beneath the blankets, the door handle was still. I waited until morning before unlocking the door. Nothing looked out of place, but I knew. I knew something had been there, and now it wanted in. The next day, I was a wreck. I barely slept, my mind looping the events of the night over and over again. My body felt sluggish, like I had spent the entire night running even though I had barely moved. I needed to talk to someone. So that evening, I walked over to Tom's porch. He was sitting in his usual spot, sipping his beer, watching the sun sink below the trees. He glanced at me as I approached. "You look like hell, kid." I hesitated. I wanted to tell him everything. About the whispers, the footsteps, the door handle twisting in the dark. But instead, I just asked, "Tom, what do you know about this place?" Tom sighed, setting his beer down. He studied me for a long moment before saying, "You hearing things?" I stiffened. I hadn't told him a damn thing. "What kind of things?" I asked carefully. Tom exhaled, rubbing his face. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "Look, kid, I already told you. You don't want to ask questions, just keep your head down. Ignore it." "Ignore what?" Tom just shook his head. "If you're smart, you'll leave before it notices you." My stomach turned. Before what notices me? He didn't answer. Instead, he just picked up his beer, took a long sip, and muttered, "It's already too late for that, isn't it?" That night, I kept every light in the cabin on. I locked my bedroom door again, this time shoving a chair under the handle. I don't know what I thought that would do. If something really wanted in, I doubted a chair would stop it. But it made me feel a little better. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And sure enough, it came back. The whispers. Not outside my door this time, inside my room. The sound was low, hissing. Words I couldn't understand. A language that felt wrong. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I turned my head slowly. And then, I saw it. A shadow. Not on the wall. Not on the floor. A shadow standing in the corner of my room. It was shaped like a person. But it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin, too wrong. And the worst part? It was watching me. My chest tightened. My hands trembled under the blanket. I wanted to move. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I just lay there, paralyzed, as the shadow tilted its head, like it was studying me. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered, "You see me now." I barely remember what happened next. All I know is that my body finally snapped out of it and I bolted, leaping out of bed, tearing out of the room, out of the cabin, and into the night. I ran straight to Tom's house, banging on his door. He opened it within seconds, eyes wide. And when he saw my face, he didn't even ask. He just said, Get inside. Now. I sat in Tom's living room, shaking. I didn't even know what to say. But Tom didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked resigned. You saw it, didn't you? He said quietly. I swallowed hard. What the hell is going on? Tom took a deep breath. Kid, I was hoping you'd leave before this started. I stared at him. Before what started? He hesitated, then finally said, "It's not your cabin that's haunted."
Check.
He looked me straight in the eyes. It's you. Tom's words froze me in place. It's not your cabin that's haunted. It's you. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. What? What the hell do you mean? My voice came out weaker than I wanted it to. Tom exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. I was hoping you'd leave before things got this bad. But you stayed. And now, it's got its hooks in you. My stomach turned. Its hooks in me. That wasn't just ghost story talk. That was something deeper. Something worse. I shook my head, trying to rationalize, trying to push back against the growing fear in my chest. No, this is just, I don't know, stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even sleep paralysis. That's a real thing, you know. People wake up and see things. Tom slammed his beer can onto the coffee table. The sharp sound made me jump. Do I look like I'm joking, kid? I shut up. His eyes were serious. Not mocking. Not amused. Serious. You think you're the first person this has happened to? You think I haven't seen this before? I swallowed hard. You mean the last guy? Tom nodded. What happened to him? My voice barely above a whisper. Tom leaned back in his chair, his face grim. He left. Packed his shit and left in the middle of the night. Didn't tell nobody. Just ran. I exhaled, trying to steady my breathing. Then, maybe I should do the same. Tom gave a short, humorless laugh. You think it's that simple? A cold chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Tom stared at me for a long time. Then finally he said, You ever stop to think that maybe it followed him too? His words hit me like a gut punch. The whispering, the eyes, the shadow. All this time I had been thinking this was about the house. That whatever this was, it was tied to the cabin. But what if that wasn't true? What if it had been following me this whole time? A sick, sinking feeling settled in my chest. I thought back to that moment in the park, the eyes opening on the picnic table. It hadn't been the cabin then. It had been me. It wasn't haunting the house. It was attached to me. A cold shudder ran through my body. I had to get out. I told Tom I needed to leave. I was going to pack my things and get the hell out of town. He didn't stop me, but he did say something before I left. Running won't help. I ignored him. I wanted to believe it would help. I rushed back to my cabin, threw open the closet doors, and started stuffing my clothes into a duffel bag. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my hands shaking as I zipped up the bag. I grabbed my keys. Almost there. And then, a whisper, right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The bedroom was empty, but I could feel it, watching. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. Just get to the door. Get out. I took one step, and the lights flickered. Another step. The walls groaned, as if the house itself was breathing. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers barely brushing against the cold metal. And then, a hand grabbed my wrist. Not a normal hand. Not human. It was cold. Too long. Too thin. and the whispers filled my head all at once, not in my ears, inside my mind. A language I couldn't understand, words that weren't meant to be spoken. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. My vision blurred, the room spun, and then darkness. When I came to, I was outside, lying in the dirt. The sun had come up, birds were chirping. The world had moved on. I was alone, but the moment I opened my eyes, I knew something had changed. It wasn't gone. If anything, it was closer than ever. I stumbled back to Tom's house. He was already waiting for me on the porch, like he knew exactly what had happened. I didn't even sit down. I just asked, "What is it?" Tom sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I don't know. Nobody does." I frowned. "Then, how do I stop it?" Tom shook his head. "You don't." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. That can't be true. There has to be a way. Tom looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he finally said, "You ever notice how there aren't dead things everywhere?" I blinked. It was such a weird thing to say. But then, I remembered. My father. The dead bird. "Daddy, where do all the dead things go?" "Something takes care of that." A chill ran through me. "Wait. Are you saying..." My voice trembled. Tom cut me off with a look that said, "You already know the answer." It was never about ghosts, never about a haunted house. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't something I could fight. It wasn't something I could escape. Because it wasn't a spirit. It wasn't a demon. It was something older. Something that had existed since the beginning of time. And its purpose? To take care of what was left behind. Not just ghosts. Not just the dead. But things that weren't supposed to be here anymore. And somehow, I had seen it. That's why it was watching me. Because I knew. And now, it wasn't going to let me forget. The realization hit me like a freight train. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't something I could run from. It was something older. Something that had existed since the beginning of time. And its job, to take care of what was left behind. Tom wouldn't say it outright, but I knew. I had seen it. And now, it had seen me. I sat on his porch in silence, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything. This thing, whatever it was, had been with me from the moment I moved into that cabin. Maybe even before that. And now, it wasn't going to let me go. I barely slept that night. How could I? I was being watched, followed. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. But I didn't hear whispers. I didn't see shadows. No voices. No eyes. Just nothing. And somehow that was worse. It was like the world was holding its breath. Like whatever was out there was waiting. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising. And I made my decision. I was leaving. For good. I didn't care if running wouldn't help. I didn't care if it would follow me. I just had to get out. I packed what little I had, threw everything into my car, and peeled out of the driveway before I could second-guess myself. I didn't have a plan. Didn't know where I was going. I just drove. For hours. The farther I got from town, the better I felt. The weight on my chest lifted. The air felt normal again. I even let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head. Maybe Tom was wrong. Maybe I could leave this behind me. And then, I saw it, right there, on the side of the road. A dead deer. Its body was fresh, too fresh. No bloating, no signs of decay. But the worst part? Its eyes were gone. Not gouged out, not eaten by scavengers, just missing, like something had taken them. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I pressed down on the gas. I didn't want to see more. Didn't want to know more. I just wanted to get away. But deep down, I knew it was still with me. I made it to a motel late that night. Some nowhere town, hours from where I started. I didn't check the name. Didn't care. I just needed somewhere to breathe. Somewhere safe. I locked the door. Checked it twice. 3 times. Pulled the curtain shut. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept. And that's when it came. Not in whispers. Not in shadows. But in a dream. I was standing in the middle of a vast, empty field. The grass was high, swaying gently in the wind. The sky was a deep, endless black. Not a star in sight. And in front of me was him, my father. He was standing there just looking at me, calm, patient, just like he always had been. "Dad?" My voice wavered. He didn't respond. Instead, he held out his hand. Something glinted in the darkness. A small silver cross. His cross. The one he always wore around his neck. "Take it," he said softly. I hesitated. "What is this?" His expression was gentle. A reminder. I reached out. My fingers barely brushed against the cool metal. And then, a sound. A low, humming whisper. Not from him. From behind me. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. Didn't want to see what was there. But my father, his expression didn't change. He wasn't scared. He just watched me. And in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "Do not fear." And then, I woke up. I sat up in bed, gasping for air. The motel room was quiet. The air was still. I reached for my neck, my fingers brushing against something cold. I looked down, and there, resting against my chest, was the silver cross. My father's cross, the one I hadn't seen in years. The one I knew, without a doubt, I hadn't packed. My hands trembled as I held it, turning it over. On the back, there was an engraving, a verse. One my father used to say to me when I was a child, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." I closed my eyes, gripping the cross tightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. I wasn't safe. I wasn't free, but I understood now. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't my enemy. It wasn't something I could escape, because it wasn't something to fear. I left the motel the next morning. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Didn't check out. I just drove. Back home. Back to the cabin. Tom was still there, still sitting on his porch, beer in hand. When he saw me pull up, he didn't look surprised. Just nodded, like he had been expecting me. I sat down next to him, my hand still clutching the silver cross. I didn't say anything at first. Didn't have to. Because now, I understood. I turned to Tom and asked the only question that mattered. "How do you live with it?" Tom smirked, taking a slow sip of his beer. Then, he tapped his chest, right over his heart. And for the first time, I noticed his necklace, a silver cross, just like mine. You ever wonder why the world isn't filled with dead things? Why you don't see animal carcasses piling up? Why the streets aren't littered with bones? Why there isn't evidence of every death that's ever happened? Because something takes care of them. Something unseen. Something ancient. Something that isn't evil, but isn't merciful either. You don't have to believe me. But if you ever wake up in the middle of the night, Feeling watched? If you ever hear whispers, speaking in a language you don't understand, if you ever see eyes that aren't there, remember this. Do not fear, because you can't escape it. You can only accept it.